I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
This is Trade Guy Scott. Welcome to this episode of The Trade Guys, where Bill and I discuss some disappointments on hand in U.S. trade policy. We talk about AGOA, the agreements, what they may be or may not be in the Western Hemisphere, and the recent decisions of the WTO on digital commerce. All this and more on this episode of The Trade Guys.
We're back with The Trade Guys. I'm Evan, filling in as host once again. I'm told it's Andrew's birthday today, and apparently hosting The Trade Guys was not on his birthday wish list. We'll have to soldier on without him. I do also want to remind our viewers to check out our Defending the Dollar series on the CSIS website and YouTube, featuring our very own Scott Miller.
Thanks for the plug. It's been a long time since I've been on the front page of CSIS.org, but I'm there today, so for what that's worth.
Yes, you are. For those of you who are only used to Scott in audio format, you can find him in video format as well.
A sight to behold.
So let's dive into our topics for today. We just saw the highly anticipated 21st AGOA Forum conclude last week. For the uninitiated, that's the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which since 2000 has provided eligible sub-Saharan African countries with duty-free access to the U.S. market for thousands of products. It's up for renewal in about a year from now in September 2025. What are your thoughts on the results of this forum, and how are prospects for AGOA renewal looking?
Well, there weren't many results, and that's really the informal topic of today's rant. We're going to be talking about failures today. Failures of imagination, failures of execution, failures of implementation, and missed opportunities. And we've got several. In the first AGOA, it hasn't failed yet because it doesn't expire until September of 2025. So there's still time to rescue it, but it's on track to have failure, and there's plenty of blame to go around. And I want to talk a little bit about that. It's important. It's a major element of U.S. soft power in Africa. The African nations seem to want it extended. And the odd thing is everybody in the United States seems to want to extend it too. President Biden called on the ministers who were at the AGOA Ministerial last week to extend it. He called on Congress to extend it. And there are many people in Congress who say they want to extend it. And when they ultimately get to it, it tends to pass by a very large margin. As with many things in Congress, it's the getting to it that is the problem. And the best way to put it is that this is, probably number 24 on Congress's important list of things to do, and they rarely get past number 5. And so it sits out there waiting for action with everybody focused on other things. And, to be fair, there are other things like appropriating money to run the government, like dealing with the debt limit early this year, dealing with the annual defense authorization. It's not like there are no higher priorities. But at some point, they have to stop and say, this matters. It matters to our relations with African countries. It matters to the way the United States projects itself out to the world with respect to developing countries everywhere, and that we need to get on top of this and do something about it. If we don't, I can predict what will happen, which is what's happened in the past, which is nothing until about a month before it expires, and then a last-minute rush, and they renew it the way it is now, because at that point, there's no time to change anything, which would be, I think, a mistake. Most parties agree that it's ripe for updating and renewal. It's not what it used to be in terms of trade. And it helps, I think, to understand a little bit more about the contents of its trade. Last year, we imported $9.3 billion of stuff through AGOA, slightly down from 2022 when it was $9.6 billion. Almost half of that was oil. And most of that was from Nigeria. So if you take the oil imports, which were 4.2 billion of the 9.6, and then you add to it what came from South Africa, which is by far the top supplier of all the other stuff that comes in under AGOA, which was around 3 billion. So oil and South Africa alone add up to 7.2 of the 9.6 billion. So not a lot for everybody else. Other partners are Kenya, Madagascar, Lesotho, Ghana, and others, but not to the same level as, the big two, in this case, Nigeria on oil and South Africa. So I think there's a lot of interest in making it a bigger thing and discussion about how to do that. And here, if Congress does decide to do something other than just roll it over, there are going to be differences of opinion about what to do. The administration wants to make it more focused on, surprise of no one, environment, labor. They want it to be sustainable, all good things, but that adds more to the eligibility criteria, makes it harder to join, makes it harder to stay in. The African countries are concerned essentially about exactly the opposite. They would like fewer eligibility requirements so they can take better advantage of it, and they would like more certainty in the process. There are two ways to get kicked out of AGOA. You can graduate, which means your per capita income level ends up being higher than the World Bank's high income level, which currently is a little bit more than $14,000. And this has been a problem for some African nations in the past when they exceed that level, get graduated out of the program, and then the consequence of getting graduated out of the program is they lose exports, their economy goes down, and they drop back below the level and then can join again. So there's a little bit of a yo-yo effect in the past that I think they would like to avoid. There's also been a lot of uncertainty generated by proposals to kick various nations out, usually on human rights grounds or on a variety of other, social grounds, for lack of a better term. And of course, for the countries that are kicked out, Ethiopia was the most dramatic one in recent years. It's traumatic and difficult, but it creates a lot of uncertainty for everybody else. You don't know how long the program is going to act. Congress or individual members of Congress have not been shy about saying, we ought to kick that country out because they've done something I don't like. And that makes everybody nervous. There have been demands now for the last 3 years to renew AGOA in advance because that sends a signal of certainty. And it sends a signal particularly to U.S. investors that the United States government is interested in Africa, wants more investment there. And the demand was to renew it for 15 years, again, to play into certainty. Well, so far, Congress has ignored that. I mean, they've had 2 of the 3 years to do what they've been advised to do, and they haven't done it. We'll see if they end up doing it on time and for a longer purpose. But the longer they wait, the more uncertainty they build into the system, and the more eligibility criteria they add, the less important the program becomes, and the fewer countries are going to subscribe to it. I've been having this discussion with colleagues here at CSIS. If you want to do something that advances U.S. interests, and there's a lot of discussion right now about how do we use AGOA to improve our access to critical minerals, which Africa has a lot of, Democratic Republic of Congo in particular. How do we use AGOA to do that? I think the Africans' approach is more, how do we use AGOA to benefit us? And one of the things that worries me is if the debate ends up being about how do we create criteria that will help us get more critical minerals out of Africa, the Africans are just going to say, this is neocolonialism in disguise, and we're not interested. The better answer, I think, is to view AGOA as one additional instrument of American soft power and to renew it in a way that actually benefits the Africans more than the Americans and use the benefit that we'll obtain from that to improve our standing in the developing world. Scott, what do you think?
Well, this is one where it helps to be outside the Washington bubble, because within the Washington bubble, AGOA is seen as a good thing and a good idea, mostly because the politics of it are relatively benign compared to other trade issues. But I think that masks the fact that other than its politics are benign, it has very few things going for it. In fact, I would argue that what we're doing is selling Brand America. And were this a division of Brand America, all the management would have been fired or would have closed it down a number of years ago. Look, AGOA is a classic sideways program. I didn't look it up, but my recollection is for the last decade, the exports that qualify for the AGOA preference have been roughly $10 billion a year. And roughly half of that is crude oil, by far the biggest element of it. And that's still the case. So what are we doing? Now, let's think about 10 billion with a B dollars. How big is Africa? Well, sub-Saharan Africa, roughly speaking, has over 1 billion people, has a GDP of, let's call it $1.5 trillion. And Brand America is offering our hallmark program. The President of the United States says, we're all in on Africa, and AGOA is the bedrock. And this amounts to something under 0.5% of total output. I think AGOA for the average African is like Cincinnati for Mark Twain, who said it's where he wanted to be when the world came to an end because he'd have an extra 6 months. Nobody'd notice when it first happened. So it's one of these things. AGOA suffers from GSP thinking. We offer countries what we think we can get away with without too many complaints from constituents. And we never ask, what is it that you want from us? What is it that we could do, the United States companies or the government could do to make your lives better? I mean, if this is our bedrock commitment to Africa, it looks like the sands of the Sahara to me. Bill's right about eligibility as well. There are 49 economies, roughly speaking, in sub-Saharan Africa. Only 32 are eligible for AGOA benefits. They've either graduated or they're ineligible for a whole series of human rights weeks. So if you think about it, what we have are these tiny, tiny little carrots that almost no one wants, but we offer them anyway. And then we give everybody with the least bit of political sense a stick to go pound the people with. And so I don't know why we're putting up with this. Maybe it's worth the trip to Washington and have a little FaceTime with U.S. officials. Maybe that pays it out for these countries. But this thing is going nowhere. And other than being politically less toxic than most trade issues, no one outside of Washington ought to admire this program. And the fact that we're just going to re-extend it is just evidence of the rot. I mean, as much as I thought AGOA was a good idea to start with, it didn't fulfill any of those desires. People who were supposed to graduate into real reciprocal free trade agreements didn't. Nothing ever happened. It just lies there. So don't know what to make of it.
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic than that. I mean, I'm pessimistic about Congress getting this act together, but I think it can be an important element of our policy. And there are some legitimate issues that need to be considered in the renewal process. The one I didn't mention, because I haven't fully thought through the consequences, is, in the middle of all this, Africa has created the African Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, the AFCFTA,
right,
which now I believe covers 52 of the 53 countries. And implementation is slower than that. I think less than half have concluded the implementation process. But that could be significant within the continent, particularly in breaking down regional barriers and national barriers between countries in Africa. And how AGOA fits into that with its eligibility limited to only some of the members, and therefore its tariff benefits, which is the major AGOA benefit, limited to only some of the members, even though they're in the process of creating kind of a giant free trade zone. I haven't figured that out yet. And it's something that people ought to be thinking about how to coordinate and make sure that we're doing something that facilitates the further implementation of the AFCFTA, rather than something that gets in the way.
That's an excellent point, Bill, and I agree with that totally. Africa is trying to do something that's really good for its own purposes. It will strengthen the economies broadly. It will improve consumer incomes, and we ought to help them do that. We ought to not be offering programs that get in the way, for sure. But if there's anything we can do to structure AGOA so it assists in something that is highly positive for the economies of sub-Saharan Africa, that would be a great improvement.
Okay, so sticking with this theme of U.S. soft power in the global south, let's talk about the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, or APEP, which is hosting a trade ministerial in Quito, Ecuador. It's going on as we speak on August 1st. Ambassador Tai is down there. We've heard a lot about nearshoring in the APEP context, particularly focused around semiconductor supply chains. We've also heard calls from congressional Democrats to use APEP as a venue to remove investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms from trade agreements. So what do you all expect to come out of this ministerial, and how has this trade track of APEP performed so far?
Well, it's going reasonably well, given the fact that we're not actively engaging in market access negotiations. So we're not really trying to increase trade, but it does have a track. It does have some clear connection to the fact that many of the economic partners already have free trade agreements with the U.S., and therefore would qualify for preferential treatment for critical minerals under the Inflation Reduction Act and also the CHIPS Act. It turns out that Intel has a large facility in Costa Rica. It used to be a test facility. I don't know what it is now, but it's closely related to the Intel production network and ought to be part of the thinking as the CHIPS Act is implemented. I think that's probably a good thing. It is not really a regional issue. That, as I see it, is a Costa Rica only, and it's only because it had a pre-existing facility. So it's not a new greenfield decision by any means, but it's a smart thing to do. And I think the notion of looking at particularly the economies who have free trade agreements with the U.S., have those high standard agreements to look for ways to make them better. Because every time we negotiated a free trade agreement, we formed this little free trade committee, which is basically the trade ministers of all the countries, including USTR, that met once a year and would have an agenda to keep these things fresh and keep them living. So there have been some ups and downs for some of these trade agreements, but there are enough of them there, and there are enough sort of resource powerhouses among these. We think of Canada and Australia as free trade partners with large shares of the Earth's crust and consequently large development in resource extraction. But there are also a number of resource-rich countries in Latin America, Peru, Chile come to mind immediately, which can provide critical minerals and have sophisticated mining and resource development industries already. So I think that part could work pretty well. Once again, the progressives' favorite little whipping boy is investor-state dispute settlement and protection of investors in general. I see this as, more scary stories about filed cases, and it's kind of tiring. I do remember the long debates during the congressional consideration of Trade Promotion Authority as it applied to the TPP, and there was a huge kerfuffle over an investor-state case filed by Philip Morris International against Australia for trademark problems. And their trademark was confiscated without question. And it was a big issue. It affected a lot of votes in the Senate. And it was a huge fight. And lo and behold, it was all about a filed case. When push came to shove, Philip Morris lost. And, Australia prevailed. So it's like, what was everybody so upset about? But really, I would prefer if the opponents of investor protections would just be more honest and say, we just really don't want investors to put money at risk in these developing countries. That's basically what they're saying. Just come out and say you're opposed to investment. You want nearshoring. Nearshoring requires investment, but you really don't want it to go there. So I wish they'd be more candid about that, but I'm not surprised. And frankly, while at one time investment treaties and investment agreements with arbitration as dispute settlement was one of the most popular improvements and popular agreements that existed in international commerce, they've fallen out of favor. Politicians don't defend them. So we're getting what we deserve here.
Well, I want to come back on ISDS, but first a short comment on the overall thing. I was more of an optimist on AGOA than Scott, and I think on APEP I'm a little more of a pessimist than Scott. I mean, we have to differ on something.
Sure.
If you look at what the trade track has accomplished so far,
not much.
Yeah, that's the right answer. Not much. In February, they established a Council on Trade and Competitiveness. And that Council on Trade and Competitiveness has gone on to do the big step of establishing committees. And the committees are on trade rules and transparency, trade and sustainable value, and supply chains and inclusive trade and SMEs. So that's a bunch of committees. The overall council is going to meet twice a year in person. And then here's the action line. The council considered proposals for a work plan under the Committee on Trade Rules and Transparency, focused on activities to implement and build upon the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement, as well as activities focused specifically on the digitalization of import documents. It's a long sentence. So what have they done so far? They've created committees and they've considered work plans. Have they actually adopted a work plan?
Oh, no, not yet.
Maybe they will today, but that would be a bold step. But even if they adopt the work plan, is the work plan going to be implemented? One of my passing frustrations in the trade business is it seems to be taking longer and longer to do anything. And we're spending more and more time creating structures and frameworks, all of which end up having a lot of talk, but are not producing outcomes that make any material difference for people that are actually in the business of buying and selling goods and services. So I think APEP is turning out to be a good example of that. On ISDS, I just make a commercial. The Scholl Chair published a paper on exactly this subject earlier this week on ISDS and APEP. And if you're interested in the ISDS issue and an elaboration of some of the points Scott made, go to the website, csis.org, and go to the Scholl Chair and look up our recent publications. Actually, it's our most recent publication, and you'll see it there. And I think a comment that is important in this debate that has been so frustrating to me is, the purpose of ISDS from the beginning has been to encourage outbound investment, to encourage foreign investment in these other countries. And in fact, the reason that the Trump administration, Ambassador Lighthizer in particular, was critical of ISDS is because they didn't want to encourage foreign investment. They wanted to keep it all at home. But now we have people coming in, members of Congress in this case, speaking on behalf of the environment, because this was an environmental letter that they wrote, saying that ISDS endangers environmental investment and environmental projects and sustainability in the countries where it exists. That big companies will go in and exploit the other country's assets and then hide behind ISDS as a way of avoiding accountability for their actions. And I think what frustrates me is, in essence, the hypocrisy of that argument, because basically they're saying, first of all, we don't want to do something that helps American companies, which I think is bothersome because that's, I think, what the American government is supposed to do. But the irony of saying that, though, is from the standpoint of the developing countries, they're saying, we don't want to promote investment that's actually going to help you. And as Scott has pointed out, and as the paper pointed out, the United States has not lost one of these things. I mean, fears that this is going to come back to bite us, which is another argument, have proved to be misplaced. And what in fact happens, and the paper talks about this, I think, with some data, is it appears that the presence of ISDS has, at least modestly, contributed to increased investment in those locales rather than decreased investment. So I'm frustrated. I mean, it seems to me to be an obviously good thing to do to help American companies defend themselves against expropriation, which is what this was about in the beginning. And there are bad countries out there that do that still. But it's also a way to put some certainty in the system to tell American companies, if you invest there, wherever there is, you're going to be protected. And it seems to me if we don't say that, we're asking these companies to go somewhere else.
Continuing on our unofficial theme here of relative lack of substantive action by U.S. trade leadership, let's head over to the WTO. Over 80 members of the Joint Statement Initiative, JSI, on electronic commerce released what's called a stabilized text last Friday, notably without sponsorship from the United States. What should listeners know about the JSI and this recent agreement?
Well, I would say serious missed opportunity by the United States. Missed opportunity to show leadership, missed opportunity to get aboard what I think is going to be an important train and sending mixed signals about our digital policy. That said, the document's a compromise. It's not everybody to begin with. The term Joint Statement Initiative refers essentially to plurilateral negotiations. This is a big one. There's about 90 countries participating in it, most of whom signed this particular text. And the initial idea was to develop a comprehensive set of digital rules for covering digital trade. This text does not do that. And so the United States, I think, is right to be disappointed. On the other hand, this is, I think, maybe a classic case of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. It does not contain everything we want, but it does contain a lot of good stuff. And my advice to the U.S. government would be, take half the loaf, and it probably is only half the loaf, take the half loaf, then go back, and have another negotiation for the other half. If you don't take the first half, you're abdicating leadership and you're just leaving it to other people to run the digital trade game according to their rules rather than our rules. That said, there's nothing in the JSA about cross-border data flows or data localization, which are key elements for the United States, which need to be there. And the JSI talks kind of put that one in the back burner fairly quickly because both of those will be the hardest to solve. But I think at this point, suggesting the agreement is flawed because that's not there is expecting more than can be delivered right now. They also failed to permanently extend the e-commerce customs moratorium, which in the short run doesn't make any difference because it's been extended for 2 years anyway as a result of the last WTO Ministerial in February. But not extending them permanently, at least for these countries, is a big disappointment. I think the U.S. is right to be disappointed about that. But again, it's one of a number of elements. I just think the fact that we're not there, first of all, weakens the agreement. It weakens the significance of the agreement because we're a major player in the digital trade space. And it abdicates our leadership in trying to get rules that are the kinds of rules that will suit the digital economy that we would like to see.
I think Bill's right here. I would only add the comment that Ronald Reagan might make. He quipped that personnel is policy. And I note that in Geneva, we think the policy forum, that is the World Trade Organization, is important enough to the United States in its international economic engagement that we post a deputy secretary. USTR is unusual because it has 3 deputies, one of whom, with the rank of ambassador, is the head of our mission to the WTO in Geneva. And that's a pretty big investment for the country to make. And I'd just ask, what in the world was that organization, that high-level, highly compensated organization doing that was more important than this digital economy agreement? I mean, given the significance of it to the U.S. economy, given the fact that we invented the digital economy, our companies are the leaders in this area. We have a tremendous amount at stake. What in the world were you working on that was so important that it took you away from this? I mean, this is totally irresponsible. I can't imagine doing anything like that. And it's not as if we didn't have the resources there. These are permanent positions that we permanently staff. I'm just curious about what you thought was more important on a day-to-day basis than exercising American leadership on this key issue. I'm embarrassed.
Good rant, Scott.
I try to come up with one once in a while. This one just feels wrong. It's like, take the politics out of it. Just look at the share of the economy and the growth of that sector and the importance to America. What are you working on? What are you doing there? I mean, what did you come to work for in the morning that was more important than leading on this issue? I can't think of anything. Maybe there's a good answer, and maybe we'll hear it from one of our all-knowing and wise listeners. But I'm mystified.
Well, there is a difference of view, apparently, certainly in the broader business community, but apparently also in the administration on exactly what our digital policy will be. We've already talked in the past about our USTR's retreat on digital policy, and the fact that that did not appear to have been widely vetted or even agreed to inside the administration. I think they're still suffering from a schizophrenia on the question, and the response has been, more often than not, to do nothing. Go back to APEP last November when they pulled the plug on a digital agreement there, I think due to political opposition from, actually in that case, from the left. But when you're trapped between the business community on this and the progressive community on this issue, the USTR response has been to sort of retreat and twiddle their thumbs, which is disappointing because there's a lot of missed opportunities here. And Scott is quite right. If we're not leading on this particular issue, we're going to be following people whose interests are very different from ours. And that's going to come back and bite us in the long run.
Well, we will end with that.
On that happy note, yes.
Some excellent rants today, just what our listeners tune in for. And I get it live. Everyone else has to wait until the podcast comes out.
Well, you've done well, Evan. Thanks for leading the discussion today.
Always a fun time. We will see you all next week for a regularly scheduled episode.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.